Okay, brethren, for a few weeks now, we've been looking at the topic of the life and times of David, of King David, with a particular reason, which is really trying to look at the perils of sin in our lives. And even for a great man like King David, sin brought some terrible consequences. And one of the reasons for looking at sin is because probably a couple of months back, we started looking at whether or not you and I could live as righteous people. Many churches say not. All our righteousness is but filthy rags. No point even trying. So therefore, the conclusion might be, well, if there's no point trying to be righteous, we, I guess, will end up just living in sin. But that, of course, as we've been seeing, is very dangerous. Some people say, well, you don't need to live a righteous life in any event. You can't, they would say, because God looks at you and he sees you righteous in your position. Not in your practice, you're still sinning, but he sees you as righteous because you're clothed in the beautiful righteousness of Jesus Christ. And so for many reasons, a lot of churches end up being quite sort of a relaxed and casual about sin and or living a righteous life, which is really quite careless. Because one good reason, well, two reasons for living a righteous life. One is to please God, and that should be enough. The second reason, more practical you could say, is that by living a righteous life, rather than a more casual and sinful life, actually protects us from harm. The more righteous we live, the less sin we'll be involved in, and the safer you and I will be. You know, David is just an illustration we've been looking at to sort of hammer home these lessons. Even a man like King David, by choosing, and it was his choice to sin, ends up with some terrible consequences. It seems, looking at David's life, that he sinned, as you know, with adultery with Bathsheba, with trying to cover up her pregnancy. Eventually, Uriah, her husband, was put in a dangerous position where he was killed in battle. Essentially murder and adultery perpetrated by the king of Israel. Now, that wouldn't, I think, have happened overnight. I'm fairly convinced in my own mind that David must have been spiritually drifting for quite a while. Months, a year, 2-3 years, who knows, right? Because we don't just sin in a major way overnight. It takes time. People may be backsliding. People might be becoming Laodicean and lukewarm. You might be. I might be. And David had, in my view at least, been drifting for some time. And then when this temptation came along, he yielded, right? And at the time, he may have thought it was just going to be a night of passion. But the consequences were terrible. I mean, God saw clearly what David did. And although God forgave David as a personal thing between David and God himself, the consequences in David's life were severe. And that's what we've been looking at the last couple of weeks, carrying on today, is just looking at the consequences of sin. You reap what you sow. You sow tomatoes, you'll reap tomatoes. You sow apples, bananas, you reap apples, bananas. You sow to the flesh, and you get some very bad consequences. So let's look at 2 Samuel. Let's start in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verses 7 to 14, which we read last week. It brings us up pretty much to where we got to. So 2 Samuel 12, verses 7 to 14. Then Nathan the prophet said to David, "You are the man," who appeared in this little parable that Nathan had given. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more." Now, who knows how much more? David only had to ask, apparently. "Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now therefore, so I mean, God saw it all, sends Nathan to bring it to David's attention that none of this is actually hidden from the God in heaven. Now therefore, so this is the consequence. You've sown certain seeds, this is what's going to now take place. Now therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, says God, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says Jehovah, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. So David had been involved in murder and violence. David had been involved in adultery. And God says, you know what? In your household, adultery and violence. You're going to reap what you've sown. Verse 12, for you did it secretly, attempting to cover up the situation. But I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. So David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die, which of course the consequences of murder and adultery were both capital punishment. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of Jehovah to blaspheme, the child also who is born to you shall surely die. And we covered that, last week. And of course, David has brought really disrepute on the God of heaven, because the God of heaven chose and appointed David as king, and now David's involved in adultery, in murder, in cover-up. All right, it makes God look, not so good choosing that man in the first place. Now, of course, David's sin, it was down to free will, right? David knew better. The commandment against adultery and the commandment against murder both appear in the Ten Commandments. It's not some sort of footnote somewhere in the Torah. These are key commandments, and it was David's choice. He knew better, but I suspect he'd been drifting for a while, not walking so closely with God. When the temptation came along, unfortunately, he yielded. But pretty clear, I think, that David's repentance was genuine, real, heartfelt, because God would have seen otherwise, and God forgave him on the spot. But that doesn't stop the consequences. God can forgive us, and of course does forgive us when we sin and repent and ask him to forgive us. But the consequences that we've set in motion, they very often continue. It's like the example I've used of picking up a big boulder, sort of hurling it into perhaps a lake or a pond. You see all the ripples coming out, the waves, the ripples come out, different directions, some to the north, some to the east and west, and they go on quite a distance, causing problems wherever they arrive. And it's a bit like that. So, David's sins became public knowledge. And I would imagine that to some extent at least diminished how people looked at King David. It probably reduced his personal authority, his status and honor, because now, our king, adulterer, oh my, our king engaged in plotting a murder and having it carried out. So you can imagine in that sense that David's personal standing, his poll numbers might have sunk quite a bit in ancient Israel. And whereas in the past of David's life, God might have intervened here and there to protect David, secure David's safety and security, now more hands off from God. Just let the consequences of David's actions run their course. We saw last week that the baby died. There's not going to be any fruit from that adulterous relationship, right? And moving on a little bit, you can see that, they've not been there. But if you look at David's life, you'll see he had apparently 7 wives and 10 concubines. So it's like 17 women in his life. Despite that, he still lusts after Bathsheba, another man's wife, and commits adultery with her, even though he's got 17 I imagine, fairly attractive young women of his own. That sort of suggests to me a little bit of a character flaw there. I mean, typically one woman would be enough, you would have thought, and certainly 2 or 3 would be more than any man needs. But David's got 17 and still lusts after a woman he is not legally entitled to have, Bathsheba. And in some ways you would think also that if that is the weakness of David, it would be visible to his sons, right, to his own family, because they've seen it publicly now. Our father committed adultery despite having 17 women in his life, and our father engaged in a cover-up of a murder which he set in motion. Now, if you're David's sons, David's family, what do you make of that? It's got to be sort of have an influence on you yourself. So look at 2 Samuel chapter 13 now. Let's move on as the troubles in David's house now seriously get underway. Verses 1 through 6. After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was, I think, the oldest in the family, so he was the crown prince, you could argue. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin. So seemingly he was, what they call, lovesick, that this is his sister, or at least his half-sister. Same father, David, but different mother. And it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. You're quite right. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimea, David's brother. Now Jonadab was a very crafty man. And he said to Amnon, "Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner day after day? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Of course, it's also Amnon's sister, half-sister, but he sort of skirts that. So Jonadab said to him, "Well, I'll tell you what, lie down in your bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me food, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat from her hand.'" Then Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let Tamar, my sister, come and make a couple of cakes for me in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." So perhaps some award-winning strawberry scones underway to be made in his sight, and then he'd feel better. So David allows that and says, "Okay, I'll get your sister to come and cook for you." Amnon looks a bit of a softie, I've got to say, pining away for his sister. David, not quite clear here. He looks a little bit indulgent, doesn't he, with his son? "Oh, okay, you should get up and get busy, but wow, you just stay there, and I'll get your sister to come and prepare some, soup for you, whatever." Let's move on. Read verses 10 through 15. Then Amnon said to Tamar when she arrived and prepared the food, "Bring the food into the bedroom, that I may eat it from your hand." Very effete, one would have thought. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made, brought them to Amnon, her brother, in the bedroom. Now when she had brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." But she answered him, "No, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing." So she puts up a bit of resistance. "And where could I take my shame? And as for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel, the wicked men in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." Well, I think he would have, because it's illegal. So it might be that Tamar simply means that she's trying to buy some time. "Oh, let's not now. Are you going to speak to the king?" And she probably imagines were that to happen, she'd make her escape. And there's no way David would have, one hopes, have allowed that. However, he would not heed her voice, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly. so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, arise, get lost. So, I mean, he didn't love her. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? It was just pure lust. Well, impure lust, right? Because as soon as he had his wicked way with her, they would get lost. Don't like you anymore. Don't want you. And he threw her out, basically. I mean, so the guy is not a nice son of David. He plots. He rapes his half-sister, right? He's moping around. Not a nice sort of guy at all, you would have thought. And we read earlier that God says all these things will happen, David, in your life. Well, there's no way that God provoked Amnon to rape his sister, right? That's not how God gets these things done. It's not that God says, well, I'll put it into the mind of David's son to rape his half-sister. That was a free choice by Amnon in his own heart, right? It's just that God might have, in previous times, intervened to stop it. God's taken his hands off now. David's made his bed. He's going to have to lie on it. That's right. So the situation carries on. Let's read verses 19 to 22. Verses 19 through 22. So Tamar puts ashes on her head, tore her robe of many colours that was on her, laid her hand on her head and went away crying bitterly. And Absalom, her brother, said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? And he obviously suspects what's happened. But now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry, but apparently did nothing, which appears to me to be a problem, right? One of his sons has raped his sister. And David's angry, I mean, understandably, but there's no record here of David actually doing anything. Didn't go and grab Amnon and, knock him about a bit, all right? Didn't send him off on a wilderness journey, teach him some discipline. Apparently, David just got angry, but didn't speak to him, didn't raise the issue, didn't seek to correct the matter. And Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced or raped his sister Tamar. So, Absalom, quiet at the time, playing it cool, but in his heart, he hates his brother and is going to plan to get vengeance, right? So you wonder about David's situation here a little bit. I mean, did David feel maybe compromised by his own behavior, that he'd committed adultery with another man's wife and then killed the other man? Did David sort of feel like, person of glass houses shouldn't throw stones? I've not been very good. I've been sort of sexually active in ways I shouldn't have been, and I've brought disrepute to God. And who knows exactly? Either way, David did nothing, right? And meanwhile, of course, Absalom is holding his peace, but only for a while.
Accordingly.
And let's look at verses 23 to 33. 23. It came to pass after 2 full years. So, some people might have thought it was all fading away and into ancient history, but no.
Not likely.
What do they say? Revenge is a dish best served cold, I think. It came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. I guess there was like feasts as well when you did this sort of work. Then Absalom came to the king and said, kindly note, your servant, that's him, has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. But the king, King David, said to Absalom, no, my son, let us not all go down now, lest we be a burden to you. Then he urged him, but he would not go. And he, David, blessed him, Absalom. Then Absalom said, well, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom urged him. So he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him to this feast at the sheep shearing competition, whatever it was.
That's indeed.
Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, "Watch now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him." This is obviously premeditated and has been for probably about 2 years. "Do not be afraid. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded, killed him. Then all the king's sons arose, and each one got on his mule and fled, because they probably thought they were next. It could look like a takeover, a coup. So Absalom's going to kill all the king's sons and try to take over. Of course, in reality, all Absalom had in mind at this point, at least, was just getting revenge on the brother who had, raped his sister. I'll just carry on for a bit. Verse 30 through 33. "It came to pass while they were on the way, running off, that news came to David saying, Absalom has killed all the king's sons, and not one of them is left," which, you see this quite a lot when the news is reported of an event somewhere, an earthquake or a sort of an attack, mass murder somewhere, on a school, whatever it might be. Early on, the information is often quite garbled. People miscount, rumours run abroad. Of course, in this case, only Amnon is dead, but the story goes out that Absalom's killed everybody. Verse 31, "So the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. Then Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, answered and said, Let not my lord suppose they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead. It's only Amnon." All right? Well, the violence in David's household has continued. The rape, obviously, was violent conduct by Amnon, but now Amnon's dead, killed by his brother. Right? That's obviously not good. And you could argue here, by the way, looking at Amnon, that's the principle of sowing and reaping there. Amnon took advantage of his sister and raped her and then threw her out. And now Amnon is dead. You reap what you sow, whoever you are, including, you and me. So already quite early on, here's rape and dishonor of one of the daughters. Here's murder of one son by another son. And then Absalom, as you'd expect, goes on the run because he knows that if he's caught, the king might possibly execute him. I suspect not, looking at David at this time of his life. But anyway, Absalom goes on the run. So 2, 3, 4 years later, Absalom is eventually allowed back into society. David meets with him, I think briefly, possibly just once, and there is a sort of an apparent reconciliation between Absalom and David, right? But it's not, I think, particularly deep. The reconciliation, I think it might be a bit shallow, and it appears, reading between the lines, that Absalom is still quite bitter about the whole situation. He might have expected his father to take Amnon to task, right? Give Amnon a jolly good telling to, strip him of his royal privileges, put him out to work in the field, do something, right? That might not have satisfied Absalom, of course. It's his sister who had been raped, but at least if his dad had done something, but probably he saw his father doing diddly squat, and now he's had to take, if you like, matters into his own hands and kill his brother. And so whilst he's sort of reconciled to his father, I think in reality it's very shallow, not deep. And Absalom, as we find out in the next chapter or two, chapter 15, starts to plot a takeover, right? It was to take over the kingdom. So let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 15, read verses 1 through 6. After this, it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. So quite a decent entourage that demonstrates your status. Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate, I guess Jerusalem. So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, because the king would be the ultimate judge, Absalom would call to him and say, "What city are you from?" He would say, "Oh, your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Your case is good and right. Unfortunately, there's no deputy of the king to hear you, and king's just got so many people to see. Moreover," Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who had any suit or cause would come to me. Then I would give him justice." And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. In this manner Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. And so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So what he's doing is, he took 2 years to plot the death of his brother. He's taking a while now to plot the overthrow of his father. Tensions are becoming the new king of Israel. So you're seeing all these people saying, if only I was in charge, I could look after your case and give you justice and you'd be compensated, and you're clear in the right, and here, let me shake your hand and put my arm around you. And eventually, he was a good-looking young man, Absalom, with a great head of hair apparently. Envy. And clearly people, or at least many people, sort of thought, he's really great, Absalom. We could do with somebody like Absalom running this kingdom, right? And you got to think here, but surely Absalom would know that his father is the king, right? And wouldn't he know that his father has been anointed by Jehovah God as king? So how could Absalom even remotely think there's something okay about deposing God's anointed? Remember the days of David. David wouldn't reach his hand out, right, to injure or kill Saul because he was God's anointed. A couple of times in the cave, once, remember, when Saul went to use a restroom in the cave, another time when Saul was sleeping in his camp, David had the opportunity there to kill him twice, but he wouldn't do it. I'm not going to reach out my hand to God's anointed, even if he's trying to kill me. And here's a case where Absalom is more than happy to reach out his hand against God's anointed, who's not trying to kill him, right? Anyway, verses 13 to 17. Now a messenger came to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." So David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." And the king's servants said to the king, "We are your servants, ready to do whatever my lord the king commands." Then the king went out with all his household after him. But the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. And the king went out with all the people after him and stopped at the outskirts. So, rather surprisingly, King David flees, right? Now, King David is God's anointed, and David knows that. He's known that for decades. He is put in place as the king by Jehovah God. Why is he turning and fleeing? The office was given to him by God. It's possibly the first time that David's ever turned his back in battle. Right? Now, I don't know why exactly. I mean, a possibility, I suppose, you could say, is that perhaps just David didn't want civil war breaking out in the city of Jerusalem with all the deaths that might be involved there, so to avoid the prospect of a sort of hot action against his son, that he thinks it might be better to exit and go into the wilderness, to leave it behind, and perhaps that way his son will just come and occupy the city without destroying and burning and killing, right? But either way, it doesn't look very good, right? Should God's anointed be fleeing the position that God anointed him for? I would have said not, but off he goes anyway. And again, I think you can see that there's some compromises now in David's life. He's not the man from earlier in his calling. Verses 23 and 30. 23, and all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. The king himself also crossed over the brook Kidron, right by Jerusalem, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. They were heading off, I guess, east. Verse 30, so David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up, and he had his head covered, and went barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up, weeping as they went up. So pretty sad procession. The king, his right hand men and women, his servants, and they're all leaving Jerusalem and weeping, got their heads covered, bare feet, beating their mea culpa as they leave, and terrible really. How did it come to that? Shouldn't David have been able to relax and enjoy his last few decades as a great king over God's people? But he made these, terribly serious errors, big sins, and, the ripples are coming out. Let's read 2 Samuel 16. We'll read verse 15 and then 21 to 22. 2 Samuel 16 and verse 15. Meanwhile, so David's left now, right? Meanwhile, Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Ahithophel, terrible name to pronounce. I do struggle with that one. But he had been a brilliant, wise counselor, an advisor to King David for many years. His advice, his wisdom was renowned. So top person to have on your side. And he had been on David's side for many, many years. But if you check 2 or 3 places, you find that Ahithophel happens to be the grandfather of Bathsheba. And I don't think Ahithophel was happy that his granddaughter had been engaged in adultery with the king. And so I get the impression Ahithophel was looking for some sort of revenge on King David, who had humbled his granddaughter. And that's why I think you see Ahithophel here on the side of David's enemies, Absalom, no longer with King David. Drop down to verses 21 to 22. And so Absalom says, what shall I do now? We've arrived in Jerusalem. My father and his merry men and women are on the run. What's the right thing to do? Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house. And all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father, who certainly would abhor you. Then the hands of all who are with you will be strong. Once it's evident that there's no reconciliation possible between you and your father. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the top of the house, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Of course, the housetop is where it's all started. The housetop is where David had been walking when he saw Bathsheba nearby, bathing in the evening. Remember, David should have been out fighting. That's the time of the year when the kings go to battle, and he hadn't, right? So it was probably poetic justice that they put this tent up on top of the same housetop, and then all Israel knows what's happening, that Absalom is, right, having affairs, whatever, with his father's concubines. That's public humiliation of King David. He's left his concubines behind, and here's his own son sleeping with them, right? Now, like Nathan said earlier, you've committed adultery. You're going to be in the receiving end of adultery. That's it taking place here, right? It's now David's turn. And apparently the commentaries say back in these days, if a victorious king acquired the harem of the previous king, that meant he was in charge. He'd now got the king's own harem. That meant he possessed everything the king had. So it was also a symbolic sign that you'd replaced the former king. I think it also says something else about Absalom's character, right? Absalom is plotted revenge on his brother and killed him. Now Absalom's plotting a coup to take over the kingdom from God's anointed. What, Absalom? Have you lost your marbles? And he's clearly showing complete disrespect to his father here by sort of having relations with his father's concubines. I mean, right? It's all a mess, right? And of course, the whole nation is being affected by this. It wasn't just between this part of the family, David and Absalom, and David and Amnon, and Amnon and Tamar. The whole nation is now affected. The king and his entourage are now in the wilderness somewhere. The king's son has taken over, apparently, and is now sleeping with the king's concubines. What? Right? And some worse to come. Look at 2 Samuel 18. Let's read verses 1 through 17. So 2 Samuel 18. And David numbered the people who were with him. They're out in the wilderness, but I think they've stopped in a small sort of town out there that's sort of friendly to them. David numbered the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. But the people answered, You shall not go out, for if we flee away, they won't care about us, nor if half of us die will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now, for you are now more help to us in the city where they had stopped. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands, because Absalom was approaching, and this was going to be, I suppose, a battle, a showdown. Yeah, that's it. Was it the OK
Corral?
Corral, yeah. This is the showdown at the OK Corral. So off they go. Absalom and his troops.
Let's stop for McDonald's first.
David and his troops. Who's going to, well, David without his troops, but who's going to win, right? Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, his 3 commanders, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. It's interesting, I suppose, even driven out of town by his son, who's murdered his brother, trying to take over the kingdom that God gave him. David is still, well, don't treat him harshly. Well, and all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. Don't harm him. So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel, meaning Absalom, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. I mean, it's all going wrong, isn't it? Here's one part of Israel fighting the other part of Israel. Here's Absalom and his supporters fighting King David and his supporters, and 20,000 people died. Right? It's quite a total. All of this really unnecessary if David had dealt with things differently, including how he handled his sons, by the looks of it. Then Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode on a mule. This would be the royal mule, which they had. Most folk had, well, not most folk, but many people had donkeys. But mules were sort of step above donkeys in terms of status. And I think mules had to be imported. So there would be royal mules. And he was on one. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and Absalom's head caught in the terebinth, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth, dangling from the branches. He had a great head of hair, I said earlier. He used to cut it, and it weighed pounds and pounds when he cut it once a year. You cut my hair, it weighs, well, maybe a gram and a push. And the mule which was under him went on, so he's just dangling there by his head. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree, as you do. And Joab said to the man who told him, You just saw him? Why didn't you not strike him there to the ground? I'd have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom, meaning, of course, injure him. Otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. Then Joab said, I can't linger with you, get out of the way. He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. That's another of David's sons now dead. All right, so that's Amnon dead and Absalom dead, Tamar raped, civil war in the land, 20,000 people generally killed. So Joab blew the trumpet in a certain way, I suppose, like a signal, So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel. For Joab held back the people, and they took Absalom and cast him into a large pit in the woods, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Not a very good outcome for Absalom, right? But could you argue here it's the law of sowing and reaping? Right? He decides to, he killed his brother, but that was sort of, fading away. David had allowed him back into the society, and David had met him and had, at least hugged, and maybe not much more than that. He could have stayed that way. Absalom could have had friends and family and banquets, but he decides to take on God's anointed. And he sets that ball rolling, or he tosses, that boulder into the pond, and now you reap what you sow. Now Absalom's dead, and he's not even in a glorious king's sepulchre. He's in a pit in the ground with boulders all over him, right? Let's drop down to verses 32 to 33. So a runner comes from the battle to the city where King David is, and King David, of course, doesn't know what's happening. In those days, you didn't have mobile phones and things of that nature. You had to wait for somebody to come to you and say, oh, this has happened, right? And the king said to the Cushite who had arrived, is the young man Absalom safe, right? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. No, he's dead as a dodo. And I hope all your enemies end up the same way King David. And he thought it was good news, the Cushite. Goes to David. Well, then the king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he had said thus, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son. So, quite clear, David is still a very sensitive man in some ways. He's distraught. He's broken-hearted. He's all emotional, right? But Absalom was not a good guy. And David has a lot to answer for, failing to deal with Amnon.
And all his kids.
Failing to deal with Absalom. Failing to deal with himself, right? And so it's not so much, I think, here that God's deliberately stirring things up, right? These people have got their own problems, just that God's no longer protecting David the way he might once have done. He's taken his hands off. All right, David, you've chosen to sin against me and despise me, and I can tell you all these things are going to happen because God knows a thing or two about Amnon's character and Absalom's character and all the rest of them, and Joab's character as well. So the consequences of David's sins continue. Sons dead, Tamar raped, civil war, tens of thousands dead in the nation, which is just a reminder, I think, to us, which is my point from day one, sin is dangerous, all right? We can't play with sin. It's good to choose to live a righteous life because it's pleasing to God and it protects us from the almost inevitable consequences of sinful decisions that we make. The wages of sin is death. That's what happens at the end of the road. But the road to your death can be quite painful, as it was here for David. The sinful choices that David made, have caused a great deal of suffering for David, for his family, for the nation, right? And it's a cautionary tale. It's for us to learn from. We shouldn't have to repeat the mistakes of David because we can read them and think, oh, wow, right, okay, I see the problems. I think I better do my best to choose wisely and to sow good seed in my life, because I can see here that you tend to reap what you sow, and I don't want to have a bad harvest. I want a good harvest. Let's move on to 1 Kings chapter 1. So after 2 Samuel, you have 1 Kings. Get towards the end of David's life, and it's not quite over yet, I'm afraid, even his last days. So we pick up the story. We're going to read 1 Kings 1:1, and then verses 5 to 8 to start with. 1:1. Now King David was old, advanced in years, and they put covers on him because he could not get warm. It seems David, there's only 70, by the way, here. So
Younger than you.
Younger than yours truly. So he was 70 years old, but by the sound of it, quite frail. As somebody said, a lot of mileage in David's life. And so he couldn't keep warm. He was fairly frail. So they got a young woman for him, young virgin woman, to sort of cuddle up to him and keep him warm, which sounds a bit odd to us, but apparently back in those days, the commentaries say it was actually a recognized sort of cure. Older men who couldn't get any warmth up were given a young lady.
Well, yeah, I'm not giving you one.
There's no chance of my getting one, but this was deemed some sort of idea about the vigour and the young woman might transfer into the old chap. Anyway, so that's him, sort of frail, and people can tell his days are numbered. He's not going to live another 10 years, they can tell that, which unfortunately seems to spur another son. Right, so verses 5 to 8. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. This is another son of David. I think it's the oldest living, because they're piling up now, the corpses. This is the oldest living son of David. He says, I'll be king. Oh, hang on, David is currently king, and everybody knows that David's son Solomon is going to be the next king. God's already approved that. But I'll be king. Really? And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him, a bit like Absalom, who in fact was his brother. Brackets in verse 6. And his father had not rebuked him at any time by saying, Why have you done so? He was also very good looking. His mother had borne him after Absalom. So Absalom's younger brother, good looking like Absalom. And it looks like David could see problems but didn't rebuke him. Then he, Adonijah, conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, with Abiathar the priest, and they followed and helped Adonijah. But Zadok the priest, the good one, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, we know him, Shimei, Rei, and the mighty men who belonged to David were not with Adonijah. So there's two groups starting to form. Those who are going to support Adonijah, who wants to be king, and of course those who are more loyal to the appointed, anointed king, David. Drop down to verses 38 to 48. So in between, trying to cut out some of the stuff here, in between, Adonijah sets a big feast and calls important people to this feast where he's going to announce that he is the new king of Israel. And Joab's there and some others are there and they're going to applaud him, right? And the king. Now, Bathsheba, who's still around, of course, and knows that her son Solomon has been chosen by God to be king. She goes to see King David in his frail state, as does Zadok the priest, and they both say to King David, look, surely Solomon is the man to be king, isn't he? Isn't that what God said to you, David? Well, do you know your son Adonijah has got a feast at the moment and is about to present himself to Israel as the king? Did you not know that? What do you want to do? And so David says, it is Solomon. That's what God said. So, okay, right now, go and make Solomon the king. Right? So that puts paid to Adonijah's plans. But let's read verses 38 to 48. So Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites and Pelethites went down and had Solomon ride on King David's mule and took him to Gihon. Then Zadok the priest took a horn of oil, I think it's the horn of oil, the one from the tabernacle area, from the tabernacle, and anointed Solomon. So it's official, right? Zadok the priest, oil from the tabernacle, pouring it over young Solomon's head. And all the people said, "Long live King Solomon!" And all the people went up after him, and the people played the flutes, rejoiced with great joy, so that the earth seemed to split with their sound. Now Adonijah and all the guests who were with him heard it as they finished eating. When Joab heard the sound of the horn, he said, "Why is the city in such a noisy uproar?" While he was still speaking, there came Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, the priest, and Adonijah said to him, "Come in, for you're a prominent man, and bring good news." Jonathan answered and said to Adonijah, "No, our Lord King David has made Solomon king, and the king has sent him with Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites, the Perethites, and they have made him ride on the king's mule," which is a royal procession. "So Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet have anointed him king at Gihon, and they have gone up from there rejoicing, and so the city is in an uproar. This is the noise that you have heard. Also, Solomon now sits on the throne of the kingdom." It's official. "And moreover, the king's servants have gone to bless our Lord King David, saying, 'May God make the name of Solomon better than your name, and may he make his throne greater than your throne.' Then the king bowed himself on the bed, and the king said, 'Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has given one to sit on my throne this day, while my eyes see it.'" So, in the nick of time, and Solomon is anointed and crowned as king, while David's still actually alive, right? And so much for Adonijah, who's like, oops, what's the contingency plan? Verses 49 to 53, all the guests who were with Adonijah were afraid and arose, and each went his way. They're serious trouble now. We're with the man who's about to overthrow the king. Oh, and let's hope the CCTV didn't pick us up coming in the entrance earlier, so they all quietly disappear into the night, leaving Adonijah like, what's happened to my friends and supporters? It's just me. Now Adonijah was afraid of Solomon, so he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar in the holy place. And it was told Solomon, saying, "Indeed, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon." King Solomon. David's still there, but everybody knows his days are numbered. "For look, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar, saying, 'Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword.'" He's now not quite the courageous future king. Then Solomon said, "If he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die." So King Solomon sent them to bring him down from the altar, and he came and fell down before King Solomon. And Solomon said to him, "Go to your house." So, Adonijah was really, in a sense, plotting treason against David, or if not David, against Solomon, whom God had appointed to be the king, right? So he's guilty of treason. They could easily execute him. But Solomon says, okay, fair enough. Everything's okay. You just live a noble, honest life, my brother, and we're fine. We're good to go. Unfortunately, I'm not going to read it, but if you read another chapter or two, Adonijah pushes his luck too far, and asks if they wouldn't mind giving him the young lady who was keeping David warm in his latter year or two, which is sort of saying he still harbors desires to be the king, have access to David's young lady friend, and the ones that might imply that he anyway. So Solomon executes him. So that's another son dead by the hand of his brother. So you're thinking, well, Tamar's been raped, Amnon's murdered by his brother, Absalom starts a civil war drives his father, the anointed king, out. And Absalom is then killed himself, dangling from a tree. Then Adonijah, another son, Absalom's brother, seeks the throne, which he's not entitled to have, and then Adonijah is executed, right? There's quite a lot of deaths and dishonor happening here in David's family. And in between all of those things, David flees Jerusalem, and at least 20,000 plus Israelites are killed in the civil war. Plus, on top of that, David's concubines have been humbled on the roof of his house. You've got to think there's absolutely no way that David would have sinned with Bathsheba. That one night of passion, if he'd been able to look ahead and see all the pain, the suffering, and the anguish that would flow from his lust and stupidity, right? He wouldn't. And I guess you and I, if we saw the things that would be consequences of our stupidity at times, we wouldn't have done them, right? But we can try and learn from other people and from their mistakes, as well as a general principle. You will reap what you sow. I will reap what I sow, and you'll reap what you sow. It's a principle, or probably, I guess, stronger, it's probably a law. Look at Galatians 6, which we've been to a few times. Just remind us of that principle/law. Galatians, Ephesians, so Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8. Do not be deceived. That means don't be deceived, right? It means this is how it works, right? There's no way around this. There's no shortcuts. You can't go over it or under it. This is the way it works. Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Whatever. So good things, good harvest. So bad things, evil things, wicked things, sinful things, the harvest will come, right? Don't be deceived. You're not going to find a loophole, right? For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. Would you say that David is a good illustration of that? Would you say Amnon is a good illustration of that? Might Absalom be a good illustration of that? Because they all sowed and they all reaped terrible outcomes. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. There are good outcomes if you sow to the Spirit. If you spend time and investments and energy and good things, kindness, mercy, compassion, right? But if you sow to the flesh, like adultery clearly is, or treason, or seeking to exalt yourself as the king, etc., or in your case, my case, might not be quite as illustrious as seeking to be the king or queen of your nation or tribe, but whatever you sow, says Paul, you will reap. And he's probably looking back at the examples of Saul and David, and unfortunately Solomon in turn, because he ended up blowing it, I think. Let's look finally at Hosea chapter 8 and verse 7. So Hosea comes just after Daniel. Daniel, then Hosea, I think it is. Chapter 8, I'll just read the first part of 7. It's the same principle we're bringing out here, Hosea 8 and 7. It's talking about ancient Israel. Hosea is written in the 700s BC, before they were taken captive by Assyria. So it's the days before that when they were just messing up badly and provoking God. And God says here, verse 7, they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. It's bad enough to sow the wind and reap the wind. But you sow the wind and God says you reap the whirlwind. Far worse than what you sowed. Other translations, instead of whirlwind, use words like hurricane. So you sow the wind, or you'll reap the hurricane. One says tornado. You sow the wind, what will come back at you is a tornado, right? So bad enough to reap what you sow, but this suggests, at least on some occasions, you reap much worse than you sow, right? Not something you and I would, I think, voluntarily want to be at the receiving end. So don't sow the wind. You'll reap a hurricane or tornado or whirlwind, right? You and I should not take that chance, right? So, we've said umpteen times now in the last few weeks, you and I should choose to live a righteous life as far as we possibly can, right? And we can. Many righteous men and women throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? Righteous men and women, you and I can be righteous. We should live a righteous life. And the more we live a righteous life, the less likely we are to be leading a sinful life. And the less sin we have in our lives, the less peril and danger and risk we have in our lives, right? So in the long run, the harvest of living a righteous life is good and better. And it will save us, if we live a righteous life and go that way, it will save us a huge amount of the pain that is associated with sinful choices. So let's be wise and choose to live a righteous life. And with that, we'll conclude today's Bible study.